Hello, kiddies. This is the story of the Trumpet of the Swan. Chapter 7, School Days. A few days after the Swans arrived at their winter home on the Red Rocks Lakes, Lewis had an idea. He thought that since he was unable to speak, maybe he should better learn to read and write. He says, I'll just try to develop myself along other lines. I'll learn as much as I can. I'll learn to read and write, and I'll bring a small piece of paper and a pencil or a chalk, and that way I'll be able to communicate with anybody who wants to speak to me. Well, Lewis liked the idea, and he thought, I'll have to do something, and the refuge was a place for the birds and the swans and the geese and the ducks, and they all lived there because it was a safe place and it was nice and it was warm even in the coldest winter. And Lewis was greatly admired for his ability to be a swimmer. He was one of the best swimmers on the whole lake, and he liked to compete with the other cygnets to see who could swim underwater the farthest and stay down the longest. He could hold his breath really, really good. When Lewis had made up his mind about learning to read and write, he decided, the way to do this, I'm going to go visit Sam Beaver and get help from him. Remember Sam Beaver? Perhaps, thought Lewis, Sam will let me go to school with him and the teacher will show me how to read and write. Well, he was excited. He also wondered whether a young swan would be welcomed in a classroom full of children. And he wondered whether it was going to be hard to learn to read and write. But he said, I learned how to fly, I can learn how to read and write. Most of all, he wondered, how could I find Sam? Montana is a big place, and he wasn't even sure where Sam lived in Montana. But he hoped he could find him. Well, the next morning, when his parents were off with the other children, the other cygnets, swimming and frolicking, Sam took off, and he flew northeast. And when he came to the Yellowstone River, he followed it all the way to the sweetgrass country. And when he saw below him a town full of people, he figured, this is it. So he circled around, and he found the schoolhouse, and he landed there, and he waited for the boys and girls to be let out of school. Well, Lewis looked at every boy, hoping to see Sam, but no Sam Beaver was there. He couldn't find him. He says, maybe it's the wrong town, wrong school. I'll try again. So he flew off to another town and landed at another school. But by then, all the boys and girls had already gone home. He says, I'll just have to look around anyway. Well, he didn't want to walk down the middle of the main street because it was dangerous and people didn't know him. So he took off into the air and circled around, flying low and looking carefully at every boy he could see. Finally, he came out of town, and about 10 minutes later, he saw a ranch house where a boy was splitting wood with an axe near the kitchen door. The boy had black hair, just like Sam. Well, Lewis glided down, circled around. He says, it's Sam. When Sam saw the swan, he laid down his axe and stood perfectly still. Lewis walked up to him, and since he couldn't say anything, he knew he had to identify himself to Sam, so he untied his shoelaces like he did back at the pond. Hello, said Sam in a friendly voice. Now they knew each other. Lewis tried to say, "Cuckoo," but nothing came out. And Sam said, I know you. You're the one that never says anything, and you used to pull my shoelaces back at the pond. Yes, Lewis jumped up and down. That was him. Glad to see you, said Sam. What can I do for you? Well, Lewis couldn't tell him what he could do for him. Are you hungry? Asked Sam. Lewis shook his head. Thirsty? Lewis shook his head. Do you want to stay overnight with us here at the ranch? Asked Sam. Yep. Here's a picture. Look at this picture. See, the boy was chopping wood, and Lewis came to visit with him. Well, Lewis nodded his head, jumped up and down. Sam said, "Okay, we have plenty of room. It's just a question of getting my father's permission." Well, Sam picked up his axe, laid a stick of wood on the chopping block, and split it right down the middle. And he looked at Lewis. "There's something wrong with your voice, isn't there?" he asked. Lewis nodded, pumping his neck up and down hard. He knew Sam was his friend, and he didn't know that Sam had once saved his mother's life from the fox. In a few minutes, Mr. Beaver rode into the yard on his cow pony. He had a horse. He got off and tied up his pony to the rail. "What have you got there?" he asked Sam. "It's a young trumpet swan," said Sam. "He's only a few months old. Will you let me keep him for a while?" "Well," said Mr. Beaver, "I think it's against the law to hold one of these wild birds in captivity. But I'll phone the game warden and see what he says. If he says yes, then you can keep him." "Tell the warden that the swan has something wrong with him," said Sam, as his father started toward the house. His father turned around and said, "What's wrong with him?" "He has a speech problem," replied Sam. "Something is wrong with his throat." "What are you talking about? Who ever heard of a swan with a speech problem?" "Well," said Sam, "this is a trumpeter swan that can't trumpet. He can't make a sound." Mr. Beaver looked at his son, and he didn't know what was going on, but he went into the house and a few minutes later came back out. "The warden says you can keep the young swan here for a while if you can help him, but sooner or later you have to let him go back to the Red Rocks Lakes where he belongs with all the other swans." And the warden said he wouldn't just let anybody have a young swan, but he'll let you have him because you understand birds and he trusts you. That's quite a compliment, my son. Mr. Beaver looked pleased. Sam looked very happy, and Lewis was greatly relieved. After a while, everyone got washed up and went in to have supper in the kitchen. Mrs. Beaver allowed Lewis to stand beside Sam's chair. They fed him some corn and some oatmeal, which tasted very good to Lewis. When Sam was ready for bed, he wanted Lewis to sleep in his room with him, but Mrs. Beaver would have no part of it. "He'll mess up the room. He's no canary. He's enormous. Put the bird out in the barn. He can sleep in one of the empty stalls where the horses are. They won't mind." So that's what they did. The next morning, Sam took Lewis to school with him. Sam rode his pony, and Lewis flew alongside. Sam had a pony? Pretty sweet. At the schoolhouse, the other children were amazed to see this great bird with his long neck and his bright eyes and his big feet. Sam introduced them to the teacher of the first grade, Mrs. Hammerbotham. And Mrs. Hammerbotham said that Lewis and Sam explained to Mrs. Hammerbotham that Lewis wanted to read and write because he couldn't make any sounds with his throat. Mrs. Hammerbotham stared at Lewis, then she looked at Sam and she said, "Nope, no birds. I've got enough trouble as it is." Sam looked very disappointed. "Mrs. Hammerbotham," he said, "please let him stand in your class and learn to read and write." Mrs. Hammerbotham says, "Why does a bird need to read and write? Only people need to communicate with one another." Well, Sam said, "That's not quite true, Mrs. Hammerbotham. If you excuse me for saying so, I have watched birds and animals a great deal. All the birds and animals talk to each other, and they really have to in order to get along. The mothers have to talk to the young ones, and the males have to talk to the females, particularly in the spring of the year when they are in love." "In love?" says Mrs. Hammerbotham. "What do you know about love?" Sam blushed. What kind of a bird is he?" she asked. He's a young trumpeter swan, said Sam. Right now he's sort of a dirty gray color, but in another year he'll be the most beautiful thing you ever saw. Pure white with a black bill and big black feet. He was hatched last spring in Canada, and now he lives with his brothers and sisters in the Red Rocks Lakes. But he can't say caw the way the other swans can, and this puts him at a disadvantage. Why? Asked the teacher. Because it does. If you wanted to say caw and couldn't make a single sound, wouldn't you feel worried? I don't want to say caw, replied the teacher. I don't even know what it means. Anyway, this is foolishness, Sam. What makes you think a bird can learn to read and write? It's impossible. Give him a chance, said Sam. He's well behaved, he's bright, and he's got this very serious problem that he can't speak. What's his name? I don't know, replied Sam. Well, said Mrs. Hammerbotham, if he's coming into my class, he's got to have a name. Maybe we can find out what it is. She looked at the bird. Is your name Joe? Louis shook his head. Jonathan? Louis shook his head. Donald? Louis shook his head. Is your name Louis? Asked Mrs. Hammerbotham. Louis nodded and he jumped up and down and flapped his wings. Great Caesar's ghost, cried the teacher. Look at those wings. Well, his name is Louis, that's for sure. All right, Louis, you may join the class. Stand right here by the blackboard and don't make a mess in the room. If you need to go outdoors for any reason, you know what you do. Raise your hand. Well, in your case, a wing. Louis nodded, and the first graders, they cheered. They liked the looks of a new pupil, and they were eager to see what he could do. Quiet, children, said Mrs. Hammerbotham. We'll start with the letter A. Well, she picked up a piece of chalk and made a big A on the blackboard. Now you try to do it, Louis. Louis walked over and grabbed a piece of chalk in his bill, and he drew a perfect A right under the one the teacher had drawn. You see, said Sam, he's an unusual bird. Well, said Mrs. Hammerbotham, A is easy. I'll give him something harder. And she wrote cat on the board. Do we know how to spell cat? That's right. Let's see you write cat, Louis. Louis steps up, grabs the chalk, and he writes cat. Phew. Well, cat is easy too, muttered the teacher. Cat is easy because it's short. Can anyone think of a word that is longer than cat? Catastrophe, said Charlie Nelson, who sat in the first row. Good, said Mrs. Hammerbotham. That's a good, hard word. But does anyone know what it means? What is a catastrophe? An earthquake, said one of the girls. Correct, said the teacher. What else? War is a catastrophe, said Charlie Nelson. Correct, said Mrs. Hammerbotham. What else? A very small red-headed girl named Jeanie raised her hand. She said, Yes, Jeanie, what is a catastrophe? And in a very small, high-pitched voice, Jeanie said, When you get ready to go on a picnic with your father and your mother, and you make peanut butter sandwiches and jelly sandwiches, and you put them in the box with the thermos and the bananas and an apple and some raisins and cookies and paper napkins and some bottles of water, and then you put everything in the back of the car, and just as you're starting out, it starts to rain, and your parents say, There's no point in having a picnic in the rain. That's a catastrophe. Very good, Jeanie, said Mrs. Hammerbotham. And it isn't as bad as an earthquake, and it isn't bad as war, but when a picnic gets called on account of rain, it is a catastrophe for a child, I guess. Anyway, catastrophe is a good word. No bird can write that word, I'll bet. If I can teach a bird to write catastrophe, I'll be big news all over the sweet grass country. I'll get my picture in Life magazine and the newspapers. I'll be famous. Thinking of all these things, she stepped to the blackboard and wrote catastrophe. And then she turned to Lewis and said, "Okay, Lewis, you write that." Lewis looked up at the word. It was the biggest word Lewis had ever seen. Figured, well, nothing to lose. He took a good long look at it. A long word, he thought. It's really hard. Well, I'll just take it one letter at a time, and pretty soon it'll be done. That's the way we do hard things, one at a time. Besides, my life is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe to be without a voice. And then he began writing, catastrophe. He wrote, making each letter very neatly. When he got to the last letter, the pupils clapped and stamped their feet and banged on their desk, and one boy made a paper airplane and zoomed it into the air. Mrs. Hammerbottom rapped for order. "Very good, Lewis," she said. "Sam, it's time you went to your own classroom. You shouldn't be in the first grade classroom. You go ahead and join your fifth grade students, and I'll take care of your friend, the Swan." And here he is, writing catastrophe on the blackboard. Huh? Did you ever see a swan writing? Wonder if there's swans going to be in your school. Back in his own room, Sam sat down at his desk, feeling very happy about the way things had turned out. The fifth graders were having a lesson in arithmetic, and their teacher, Mrs. Snug, greeted Sam with a question. Mrs. Snug said, "Sam, if a man can walk 3 miles in 1 hour, how many miles can he walk in 4 hours?" Sam looked at her and said, "Well, kind of depends on how tired he got in the first hour." And the other pupils roared and laughed. Mrs. Snug rapped for order. "Sam is quite right," she said. "I never looked at the problem that way before. I always supposed that a man could walk 12 miles in 4 hours, but Sam, you may be right. He may not feel too spunky after the first hour. He may drag his feet and slow up a bit." Well, Albert Bigelow raised his hand, and he said, "My father knew a man who tried to walk 12 miles, and he died of a heart attack." "Goodness," said the teacher. "I suppose that could happen too." "Anything could happen in 4 hours," said Sam. A man might develop a blister on his foot, or he might find some berries growing across the road and stop and pick them and eat them. That'd slow him up even if he wasn't tired and didn't have a blister." "It would indeed," agreed the teacher. "Well, children, I think we've all learned a great deal about arithmetic this morning, thanks to Sam Beaver. And now here's a problem for one of the girls in the room. If you're feeding a baby from a bottle and give the baby 8 ounces of milk in one feeding, how many ounces of milk would the baby drink in 2 feedings?" Linda Staples raised her hand. "About 15 ounces. "Why is that?" asked Mrs. Sugg. "Why wouldn't the baby drink 16 ounces? "Because he spills a little bit each time," said Linda. "It runs out of the corners of his mouth and it gets on his mother's apron." By this time the class was howling so loudly that the arithmetic lesson had to be given up. But everyone learned how careful you have to be when you're dealing with figures.